Azarel, welcome to the Business Karaoke podcast. I'm super excited to have you, and this is it's really exciting because you're a LinkedIn friend of mine. We've never met in real life. You're a LinkedIn friend.
Hi, Brittany. Thank you. Thank you to you. And hi, good morning, wherever you are.
Yeah, wherever everyone is in the world, right? So, I was super interested to connect with you because I saw on LinkedIn just how much fun and excitement you bring to mobility. And if you think about it, mobility is something that I don't necessarily know a whole lot about, which is why I thought this is a perfect opportunity to connect with you, bring you on the podcast, and kind of not only educate myself, but maybe anyone else who's also interested. So, thank you so much for making time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to you. I think I bring no fun to mobility. I think mobility brings us fun.
Hey, I love that. That's exactly right. I like that. So we're going to go on like a whole journey today. We're going to talk about everything from like the traditional train systems. We're going to kind of look at where we are right now. We're also going to be looking to the future. But kind of before that, I wanted to check in with you and see what is it like being a transport and mobility consultant in the wake of a global pandemic. What is life like? How is your day to day? How's your job changed?
Yeah, well, I think these days, these Corona times are very interesting from a mobility point of view because it's teaching us that mobility is not about transportation, but it's about like approaching people to what they actually need. And some
Mhm.
of these necessities doesn't need to be, you don't need to go out of your house to fill up them as we are now calling with Zoom, right?
Mhm.
So it's a very turning point, I think, for our industry, and I hear many experts talking about what it's going to be for our profession. But beyond that, I think I personally like the whole idea of moving people around and
Mhm.
in a sustainable way, in providing their whatever transportation options they actually require. So
Mhm.
I think we are seeing a bright future regarding the new options that are coming and the new approaches that are coming and in this field. And I think Japan is definitely one of the best place to be right now
Oh,
in
really?
that regard.
What makes you say that? Why Japan?
Well, Japan has been like for basically since Japan exists, it has been a very innovative and
Mhm.
it has been always a first player when it comes to mobility. And in Japan, mobility, something we have learned Corona in the world is that mobility is not about transport, as I say, it's about approaching necessities to people. And you
Mhm.
to do so, we use transport, right? But in
Mhm.
Japan, since long time ago, and by long time ago I mean more than 1 century ago, there
Mhm.
was already a conception that mobility that was this idea of bringing activities or necessities to people through
Mhm.
transportation, and that connection is what it makes Japanese transportation so enjoyable because it's
Mhm.
not just I'm riding a train; is that the whole a range of services I need is actually provided by the train itself.
Yeah, that's so right. Well, I think that sounds like a really great place for us to kind of like jump into our conversation. So, when we think about particularly mobility or trains or moving large amounts of people, very high on the list is Japan, right? I think Japan is almost as famous for their crazy TV game shows as they are for those YouTube videos of like people being pushed in trains. I think that's really kind of sometimes the image that people have of Japan. So when we think of trains, when we think of mobility, obviously Japan's super high on the list. But let's talk about how Japan kind of got there. You mentioned that that hasn't always been the case. That actually, if we do go back a century ago, Japan began their kind of like mobility or their transportation journey quite differently. Can you dive in a little bit to that and tell and walk us kind of through the early stages of that journey? And as you mentioned, when we say early stages, we're talking about like over a century ago now.
Yes, I mean Japan in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, was a feudal system that was not
Mm-hmm.
little touch with the rest of the world, and eventually, for some historical reasons, it was forced to modernize, right? And at that time in the 19th century, the cutting edge transportation technology was railways.
Mm-hmm.
So they brought people to Europe to learn about railways and to Americans,
Mm-hmm.
and they brought the idea of railways that was actually relatively successful at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point in the early 20th century, when they already got some infrastructure laid down, where they wanted
Mm-hmm.
to explore new ways to management and so on, and they one of the interesting things is that in at that time Japan was still being mostly inspired by what is kind of was when what was going into the West. It was still sending people to learn from the West, and many of the things that we can see now in Japan are actually
Mm-hmm.
what happens in Europe 100 years ago. For instance,
Ah.
in the early 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
uh, Tokyo Railway Company, which is a current
Mm-hmm.
railway company, one of the most both the railway companies, private railway companies in Japan,
Mm-hmm.
in Tokyo, they send some people to England, and in England they learn about the London Metropolitan Railways, which is now Transport for London,
Mm-hmm.
is part of Transport for London, and they realized that what they were doing in England is that to develop railways along other services such as real estate. So what they do is that
Mm-hmm.
along the railway, new developments will surge, and that will increase the demand for the railway. So the railway company was motivated to develop that, and we can
Mm-hmm.
see that example in London, where I used to when I used to live before. By the way, there are certain districts that were developed by the railways, and certain commercial departments that were in the inner London. So people will need to go forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Japanese, for example, they took that idea among others, and they copy here in they bring it to Japan and they
Mm-hmm.
adapt it. And we can see, for example, in 1919, it was the first garden city in Japan. So garden city is actually a concept made in the US and the UK that was copied in Japan. And while this concept eventually uh, dissipates of
Mm-hmm.
shadow shop in the westward, in Japan was very successful because this garden city in 1919, which is now what we call Denentoshi, sorry,
Mm-hmm.
Denenchofu station, has been relatively successful in that. And
Mm-hmm.
they start to think about this actually works, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they
Mm-hmm.
start to think we are a railway company, and mobility at that time was basically railways. Later,
Right.
we may talk about other kind of mobilities, but they were thinking about we are railway companies. We need huge investments,
Mm-hmm.
and our infrastructure is gonna last very long. So, one thing in Japan is that, which is I think is not only for mobility, but in general, is that they tend to think in the short term, but also in the very long term.
Mm-hmm.
So, railway companies do not think about what they're gonna do in the following 5 years, but what they want to be in the following 10, 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think that was a clear difference about why Japanese succeed where West countries were less successful, even though they were the first ones to develop those initiatives.
Mm-hmm. I think that's super interesting because you mentioned that this was a time where Japan was cut off for the world and they had to modernize. And I'm kind of internally laughing a little bit because this is exactly kind of where we see ourselves again, right? Especially in this, obviously now it's like due to a global pandemic. It's not due to like, politically motivated reasons or whatever. And so if we think about the Japan being closed right now, and especially, each country obviously has approached the coronavirus very differently. But Japan took a very strong position in terms of in terms of mobility and letting people in and out, things like that. The other thing that I can't help but wonder is it's so interesting that if these traditional Japanese companies went to Europe and like found maybe the secret sauce or maybe what kind of was working, I wonder where the disconnect was when we think about efficient train systems. Unfortunately, people don't think of London anymore. Like if you think of complex train systems, of course you think of London, but in terms of efficiency and in terms of the experience, for me personally, London isn't really one of those top players. Where do you think the difference was? Why do you think Japan was able to kind of scale that really quite well, whereas we've seen the people who had originally launched these systems, London, etc., didn't have the same success? Where do you think maybe things changed?
As someone who was working before in the UK, I was working in Jacobs, which is one of the largest consultancy, and one of our clients was Transport for London. So I would like to say that we may complain about transportations in many cities, London, Paris. Well,
Mm-hmm.
okay, for Paris I can go with it because SNCF is sometimes have some structural issues, but um, In general, in the West, we normally complain because we complain a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But they actually their transportation systems in most West and East
Mm-hmm.
European cities are actually pretty much robust.
Mm-hmm.
Although I do agree that, for my opinion, and it's not because I love trains or I am here in Japan, I do believe that Japanese mobility system in general is far more developed here in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a very important issue and that we
Mm-hmm.
cannot neglect is that, politically speaking, the West suffered a whole transformation during the 20th century. We moved
Mm-hmm.
uh, from medieval cities that were pedestrian friendly to railway based regional development, and then we jump into the American model of car based cities. So
Mm-hmm.
we design our cities for fit that automobile way of life,
Mm-hmm.
whereas in Japan they didn't. They
Mm-hmm.
did to a certain extent, because
Mm-hmm.
we cannot neglect, for example, the development of highways after the World War II.
Mm-hmm.
But and we cannot also neglect, for example, the scrapping the tram network in large cities in Japan, because that was the trend at that time. But
Mm-hmm.
they didn't scrap the railway network. They didn't
Mm-hmm.
reduce their railway network. And I think a very big difference between the West or most West countries and Japan is the praxis in general, not only for transport, but precisely that Japanese railway companies have been able to keep that practices that for some people may looks like obsolete, but that consistency in their operation, whether it's cutting edge or not, is what actually has led them to be so good and the operation side that we can see now. This is
Mm-hmm.
why railways in Japan are so punctual.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as much as they could be in the
Right.
network, and so safe and reliable.
Mm-hmm. There's so many points that I want to dive into now, but I do want to touch back on that you mentioned that we moved from like essentially medieval cities that were pedestrian friendly to then like the kind of the car model. I lived in Germany for 8 years. I had the pleasure of living in Germany for 8 years. And this is kind of maybe a country that I think is maybe in the middle, where there's still very much, that pedestrian friendly culture, like Fußgängerzone and things like that, where there are no cars and things like that. But then they still very much became a car country, right? Whereas the Americans kind of dropped walking and pedestrian culture really altogether. And what we see in Japan is that having a car, despite Japanese car companies being just some of the largest in the world, currently in 2021, this is, just for reference, when you listen to this in 10 years' time, and now Tesla is taking over the world. But if you think about that car having a possession or possessing a car, owning a car for a regular household in Japan, particularly in the metropolitan areas, is not only not necessary, but it's not even a goal. I don't hear people saying, gee, I'm looking to buy a car, or I want to buy a car. I don't hear that. So you do see that maybe it's not only the business infrastructure, but also the social structure behind thinking how people live. And one thing, if we think about Japanese railways, that kind of stands out to me more than other countries, is how they took these. They made railways ecosystems, and so even like underneath the train, and you'll see, for example, and I know 62% of our listeners are in Japan, so you know this, but if you go to places like particularly Shinagawa or these kinds of areas, you see just kilometers of underneath the railways, just of shops, and of businesses. And you recognize, and something I'd love to hear more of your opinion about, is that connection between the transport and society actually drives business. It's, you're moving people, you're moving money, you're moving opportunities. And I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on how Japanese railways saw the connection really quite well between society and transport, and then kind of drove that to drive more sustainable business.
Yes, this is actually a very hot topic. It has been a hot topic for a long time, and Japan has been, I think, the beacon in the world regarding that implementation of those services, which is not what we call non-fair revenue. So basically,
Non-fair revenues. Mm-hmm.
so how to obtain revenue from other services that they are complement the railway services.
Hmm.
And this is something that Japan has actually mastered since, I think, ever. And now with the digitalization is having a little bit of flip-flop, and it's actually being enhanced to the
Hmm.
point that, for example, for JR East, which is the largest company in Japan, railway company in Japan, and the second largest company, private railway company in the world. The first one is actually
Mm.
JR Tokai.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
these companies, for example, in JR East, about like for every non-fare revenue, there's about like I think six times railway tickets revenue for revenue,
Wow.
and this
Hmm.
with the new strategy of 2027, which is now under revision, they are actually aiming for bringing more balance and do kind of like 5, 4, 7, 8 things like that. So they are actually focusing on that part for because the economic perspectives, but also I think COVID is going to help also to realize that
Mm.
the sustainability of the business might be not focusing on the transport part, but the mobility, the
Mm.
connection between both, right? So
Hmm.
now with that said, I think that this comes down again when we go back to how railway emerged in Japan, with
Hmm.
this like real estate development and railways, which eventually start to work out in not only real estate but also in services, right?
Hmm.
And these services, I mean, we are talking about maybe a few decades ago, right?
Hmm.
These services permit the railway company to sustain their business because, for example, as you say, it's pretty much amazed that every single store you see within the railway company, within the rail station,
Hmm.
whether it's in the station or in the building, station building, it's not there randomly. I mean,
Mm.
there's a whole sense
Hmm.
on how, for example, how railways companies may even know what is your favorite coffee at morning. I'm not joking. This is actually true,
Yeah.
because they can, using their, for example, their digital systems, their for
Mm.
example, their IC car systems,
Yeah.
they can track users. They know, for example, where should be the vending machine put in the
Right.
station based on different values, traffic, pedestrian traffic, and so on, right? So that kind of like optimization and that kind of like a range of services is what actually has permit to the railways companies to focus not only on the transportation provision itself, but the
Hmm.
service provision.
Um, let's jump into a little bit more about like these non-fare services that you were talking about in terms of that like customer journey. So we work in design thinking. So we also believe that business sustainability or business growth is found in the experience. So not necessarily in the product or the service, but in the entire customer experience. And so you could almost imagine that through, having data like Suica, because if you think about it, you pay with your Suica, right? So if I pay with my Suica for many things, maybe it's a coffee or whatever, which is almost like an interchangeable credit card in Japan, really, like the Suica. If we think about that, and also the company knows exactly like my where I am, which station I get on at, which station I get off at, understands my routines. It could almost develop or could suggest services to me, like, hey, on a Wednesday, you often get off at this place, and we also notice that when you're in this area you buy a coffee from this place. Did you know that on Wednesday there's actually the same coffee place, or in the same area, so maybe you want to go to that cafe or things like that. What other of these kinds of like non-fare services focused on like the customer experience of of using the network, of using the train network, what are some of the other opportunities that you see? And if there's so many that we have to do another podcast, that's okay. We can bring you back. But what are some of the top ones that you see?
Yeah, well, I think that bringing what you say about customer experience, I think this is what a big clear difference with the Japanese railways against, for example, what is going in other countries. Because again, when we think about the whole experience, when we think about how people is connected to the railway itself, to the point that here in Japan, for example, it is often say that you can identify yourself with your railway line or a railway line. For example, people who live around the Tokyo lines, which is
Hmm.
in the south part of Tokyo, they often will live their life mostly around the Tokyo lines. For example, they
Mm.
may go to stores that are in reach of these lines, they may work on along these lines. I mean, even
For
for example,
sure.
the
Yeah.
decision when we think about where should I move in Tokyo, you might think about my company is actually in the Tokyo line, therefore I want to live in the Tokyo line because it will be cheaper, but also it will
Mm-hmm.
provide me services. So this kind of identification has also created a lot of train railways fans in Japan to a point I've never seen anybody anywhere else, including myself. And I think this kind of like identification with that experience is another success of their railway companies. Not only to say I'm using the metro to move every day because I need to use the metro because the most convenient, but also because there's all these activities and all these experience I enjoy
Mm.
to do there. And coming back to the non-fair revenues, so a clear, as you mentioned, a clear point now, what is highly strength at the moment is the Suica, what you call the Suica. So for the audience that may not know, Suica is basically a icy
Oh,
car. So
wow.
it's like
Just for those listening.
actually I have all different, but I think that was too much. So
Yeah. So
uh,
Azarel has about how many with 20? 20 cards in his hand right now?
no, I think I have about 60 or 40 right now. I
Oh,
don't know, but
geez.
I have some that I don't even know where they are because I have friends who bring me some. So I have all over the world as well, and you can actually collect them in Japan because there are many, many types. There are good thing is that even though there are many, many types, the majority of them are interchangeable. So you can buy one in Hokkaido in the north of Japan,
Mm-hmm.
and you use in the south of Japan, which is another success. And maybe
Mm-hmm.
we can come back later to this, which is that interoperability.
Mm-hmm.
But coming to the non-fair revenues, now since couple of decades ago, railway companies and also non-only railway companies, but other companies are focusing on that digitalization, the use of data, and how that data can optimize the operations as well.
Mm-hmm.
This is something they have used for decades. I mean, since they were
Mm-hmm.
born. But digitalization definitely has provided a new way to do this and
Mm-hmm.
has also enhanced the potential business models they may run.
Mm-hmm.
And this jumps into the what I call the latest or the last stage of transport digitalization, which is mobility as a service,
Mm-hmm.
where Japan is actually being definitely a world leader in this regard. So it's the provision of transport to different individuals in a single application. Not talking about phone applications, but in
Mm-hmm.
a single user interface.
Mm-hmm.
And when we think about it, when we think about so many services all put together, we can see that uh, railways companies can actually optimize their services to serve their users, but also they also can understand better what the users want and develop new services based on that, or they can tailor their operations. For example, in Japan, as you may know, the Japanese demographic prospectus is
Mm-hmm.
actually for the future is a point of concern. And in rural Japan, for example, we know that railways companies are disappearing. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
nothing. Nevertheless, 3 days ago, Hokkaido closed a whole JR Hokkaido closed a whole railway line
Oh,
in
wow.
a lack of passengers. And this is
Mm-hmm.
a trend that we are seeing, right? So what they are doing is, and this is, for example, what I do at my company, they are changing that railway model, that very
Mm.
strict, rigid railway model to on-demand services because they
Mm.
still they still know their services they provide. They still want to provide that mobility options to the
Mm-hmm.
people, but these on-demand services they are actually a more efficient way to do it than the current railway operation.
Mm-hmm. I that's absolutely such an interesting topic, especially to dive into. At this point, I kind of want to talk about the elephant in the room. I want to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room, which is the the discrepancy or the gap between the maturity of mobility in Japan, but the immaturity of data optimization and digital transformation and things like that. So when we think about these kind of on-demand systems, understanding your customer, tracking customer behavior in order to find moments to delight them in their journey, in their day, this relies not just only on having a mature mobility infrastructure, which is what we certainly see in Japan. One thing that I see, and I'd love your input on this is there is a significant gap between the maturity of the mobility and the infrastructure that we see in Japan, but then the immaturity of data, and how to use data and just digitalization in general. Even though we do see Suica, even though we do have like crazy things like Shinkansen and stuff like that, people would be maybe surprised that the back office when it comes to data and digitalization isn't nearly as maybe advanced as maybe the face of the company is. So can you talk to us a little bit about if we're to go on that journey, that future that you're talking about, as in, these like tailored services for customers, that's going to require the Japanese companies to not only have a mature mobility infrastructure, but also doesn't it require a strong digital infrastructure as well? And isn't there a gap?
Well, certainly, Japanese mobility companies are going into that digitalization train, and they are definitely upgrading their IT systems. Never like last year, for example, GREs make an overhauling of their Ekinet system, which is their
Mm-hmm.
uh, ticketing platform. And however, uh, I do believe that Japanese mobility companies are actually very well developed when it comes to digitalization, but
Mm,
not perhaps not in the way we are for the most countries in the West may understood.
mm,
But I I think in this way. So the Japanese railway companies and mobility companies by extension, they have focused traditionally on provide the what they call the physical layers of transportation
mm-hmm,
infrastructure and stuff. Now, to do so, there are small parts where the digital layer, so data, provides a little value, but that little value is actually significant when you put into the system, right? Because it
mm-hmm,
provides you, again, as I said before, more tailored operations,
mm-hmm,
better understanding of your customers, and so on. Now, the thing is that the railway companies are huge companies. I mean, even a small railway company is still a very large company,
mm-hmm,
their corporate environment. So one thing we need to understand, and is no much difference from something we have seen in the West, is that these railway companies, they need to look in the long term. They
mm-hmm,
cannot simply just jump into any single thing, any single technology they just pop up on Earth. They need to make sure that this vision they have
mm-hmm,
actually is in line with that new technology. So
mm,
in my experience supporting, for example, foreign or Japanese companies to get into Japan or overseas, I think a very strong friction point is not about how technology is bringing a value, but how
mm,
can you implement that technology into the process of the company, and
mm-hmm,
how the company will actually will appreciate that value. So how that actually provides a real value. And I think Japanese companies in general are relatively conservative when it comes
mm,
to just absenting and embracing new ideas blindly. But as soon as they can see that value, I think they work very well on achieving that in the long term. So I think that digitalization, the digital platforms for the transportation companies here in Japan, they are not behind,
mm,
although certainly some of them they require some upgrades and they are working on that, but
mm-hmm,
they are simply just taking enough time to make sure that every change they do, every improvement is actually good for everyone, which is
mm.
different to, for example, the West.
Right, which is actually the reason they have been so successful in the first place, because it's interesting, isn't it? Because you have this fast-paced, industry, to pardon the pun, but at the same time, you have to make sure that the changes that you're implementing are going to be relevant in 10 years, in 50 years. So it's this, it certainly is maybe this balance between, we've come this far, we've been this successful because we built infrastructure that we could rely on for 100 years, and now maybe the infrastructure itself isn't physical, maybe the infrastructure now it's soft, maybe it's software, maybe, as you mentioned, it's not the physical layer, it's the data layer. And then we think about how can we take that same mindset that put us, and when I say us, I mean like Japanese rail, like companies, Japanese railroad companies. How can we take that same mindset that put us on such a good path, um, and but in a digital world, right? Because as you mentioned, it's one of the benefits really is that they do design that it does fit for everyone. Obviously, there's challenges with that, but it's not all bad. There are some really good things.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, digitalization is definitely a trend in the future. But as I always hear when it comes to transport experts, we need to remind that if we talk about mobility and accessing services, digitalization is actually a big thing, because digitalization can actually enable people to access
Hmm.
those services. Again, as we are now doing as soon as conversation, but they will still require people to be moved around in transportation, and that's not digitalization. In the end, you need to have a train, you need to have a taxi, you need to have a vehicle, you need to have a
Hmm.
way to move up. So what the Japanese, in what I can see from the current developments, which are a lot, is that the Japanese are envisioning that digital part as a support of that physical layer. And even the government has a clear strategy in that, called Society 5.0,
Hmm.
where this physical layer is a bottom part and the digital layer is supporting it, right? So I think that a very big difference is that the Japanese companies are investing in that, and they are piloting a lot of experiments in that, to precisely understand what value can bring this, what value actually bring these technologies, and which ones of them are worth, which ones of them they don't. And this is, I think, something very nice that will allow, in the long term, will allow Japanese mobility companies to succeed on what they are
Hmm.
doing, because they will be able to discriminate technologies that provide a value to those who are not.
Hmm. One other thing before people, jump up and down and say, I've been in a cab and they don't accept Suica and they don't accept credit cards, they only accept cash, or, they've had times where their taxi drivers pulled out an actual map and, they don't have Google Maps, for example. I remember this happened to me. I was in a taxi and the guy pulled out like an actual physical map book. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you have no access to the data if there's an accident, or we have no idea when we're going to get there. And that was one of the most stressful taxi rides of my life. But before we kind of like jump into where the opportunities for improvement are in Japan, let's kind of dive a little bit deeper into what they did really well. And you mentioned that the railway privatization in Japan was much more successful than maybe we saw, for example, like in the West, in the Anglosphere. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that privacy or how those privatization journeys can be so different?
Yes, well, privatization normally all over the world has been no, it has little success. Whereas transportation, medical services,
Hmm.
education, there are very very few cases, and one of them is definitely the Japanese railways. But I would like to say one important thing is that for the audience, we need to know that the reason why privatization came in the 80s, it was because decades of very poor revenue, from very poor economic perspectives from the Japanese national railways at that time, and eventually for some political reasons, as well as a series of strikes and a lot of abuses by the railway workers as well. This actually is true. In the 60s and 70s, eventually got privatized. And what they did was they cut the Japanese national railway companies in different sections based on their territorial circumscription, we can call them, because otherwise the monster that is Japanese national railway companies, it was impossible to
Hmm.
privatize. And I want to say that it is true, it has been relatively successful, but before that, I would like to say that, but we need to understand also that it has been very unsuccessful in certain places.
Hmm.
What I mean is that we can see that for big cities where there was no concern about the economic sustainability of the railway industry, Japanese companies that operate in these cities, they are doing well. For example, JR East is doing extremely well in Tokyo.
Hmm.
JR West is doing extremely well in Osaka and the region of Osaka. JR Kyushu is doing well in Fukuoka and surroundings. But then when we go to JR Hokkaido, which is currently a very big issue in Japan,
Hmm.
because they never make a profit and they are closing lines all the time because they cannot sustain their operation in such rural area. Or in
Mm-hmm.
Shikoku, where the only profitable line they have is the one connecting to the JR West, which is connecting
Mm.
the main island of
Mm-hmm.
Honshu. So we need to see that it has been successful for companies as a whole, but for regions, we still see that there's a big difference between big cities and regions. Now, why they were so successful is because a very big difference against the West, or what happens in the West and in Japan, is that in Japan, there were private railway companies since their inception 100, 450 years ago. So to have that know-how, and more importantly, to have that corporate environment in Japan where there's some sort of corporativism, has actually ensured that the railways companies got the
Mm.
right business environment
Mm-hmm.
to develop those models.
And if we think about, you mentioned that actually getting a train on time consistently is incredibly difficult, incredibly difficult. And if you think about, for example, like the Japanese, or the Japanese system, which requires multiple really entities to collaborate, but at the same time they're competitors, right? So they have to find, how do we compete and collaborate in order to achieve our goals. That's an incredibly, it's quite a complex ecosystem if you think about it, right? What do you think maybe the right balance is between collaboration and competition between these different entities?
Yes, I think Japanese corporates in general, not talking about mobility, but in general, are very good at defining lines for cooperation and competition. And they often, like Japanese business practices, they often call in these kind of like, we can call it corporate organizations, cartels. I mean, these kind of like groups, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so I think this is actually a success for the from the Japanese side, and this came also down to the historical economic structure of Japan. Before World War II, Japan used to be organized around the zaibatsu, which is like large
Mm.
conglomerate of businesses.
Cyberscape, it's yeah.
Keiretsu was the evolution. But
Mhm.
even after that, when we see the post-war developments, we see that the government itself was working in a very protectionist ways to
Mhm.
precisely spool the industry of Japan, right? And eventually, things, well, big groups, some of them went down, some of them went up, some of them conglomerate more power and so on. But railway industry all over the world, not even in Japan, is a very, very capital intensive. It's a very, very intensive industry. So therefore, this conglomerate makes actually a lot of sense.
Mhm.
This natural
Absolutely.
monopoly
Mhm.
may actually a lot of sense from the point of view of the operator.
Mhm.
So one thing that, for example, we something that amazed me is that I don't know any other place in the world. If someone knows, please do forward me an email because I would like to know. But in Japan, they have these like through services. So
Mm.
through services, and I will give you an example soon, is that you can take a train, for example, in Churinkan, which is a
Mhm.
station in Kanagawa. You can take a train in Tenentoshi Line. The Tenentoshi Line is a train operated by Tokyo Railway Company, which is a
Mhm.
private railway company. Then in that train, you will arrive to Shibuya. And in Shibuya, without a lighting of the train, just remain on board. You're in the metro network, which is operated
Mhm.
by Metro. And
Mhm.
if you continue to Oshiage Skytree, you still remain on train, and here there are some options, but you may end in the Tobu line, which is actually leading you to Ibaraki or to Chiba, very
Mm.
far away, and it's operated by the Tobu company. So you have here like 3, 4 companies operating common rolling stock, and you have we having the same infrastructure requirements.
Mhm.
And for that, for the user experience, this is amazing because it enables you to live somewhere else, and with no transfer, with a very seamless with a very seamless experience, you can access to the whole train network without even think about why you're gonna pay about.
Yeah, absolutely. And the pay thing is actually really really important for me. The one of the things that made my life as a user really so much better was the like the digitalization of the tickets. And so when you would just touch off, they would calculate, for example, the revenue, or they would calculate your fare for you. And if you had to think about it, if you actually took the manual experience, you would have to buy separate tickets. You would have to have here, and then get off, and then get this, and then when you come out of the gate, put both the tickets in, and it's a whole thing. So I think that is certainly a real testament to like a fine balance between collaboration and cooperation. I think that's really great. Before we go into the future, I think we can't talk about Japanese mobility without talking about the Shinkansen, right? If we think about Shinkansen is like one of those things that kind of Japan gave to kind of gifted to the world. Talk to us a little bit about like the story behind Shinkansen, because I know most people probably have listening to this has probably ridden a Shinkansen, but maybe they don't know how the Shinkansen came to life. So why don't you talk to us about the birthing story of the Shinkansen?
I think Shinkansen is, I mean, truly, when you think about Japan, the first thing is the bullet train, right?
Yes,
So,
that's true.
and it's amazing that we now understand like Shinkansen as something very obvious, right? We give it for granted it's there, right? But when we go back to the 50s, when the whole idea started, I mean, the whole idea actually started before World War II, but the implementation was in the 50s, and it was built. It was completed in 1964 for the Olympics. When you think about the idea was like unbelievable for many. Like
Mm,
at that time, I mean, when we think about it, we are thinking that at that time there was in the 50s, 60s, the people were actually thinking that automobiles and maybe aircraft will be the future of transport.
hmm
Railways were something from the past, right? And there was this person which we need to credit him, which is Shinji Shogo, who was the president of Japanese National Railway at that time. Came with the idea of, hey, what if we make a high-speed rail between Tokyo and Osaka to relieve congestion?
mm,
Because at that time, the Japanese economic development was putting a lot of stress in the infrastructure of the country. And when we think about it, we're talking of in a time that going like 200 kilometers per hour, that was what Shinkansen did. It was like
deathly
unbelievable.
almost. Yeah, it was almost you'd almost risk your life.
It's like talking about now about hyperloop. Okay, with
Ah,
obviously there are some
interesting. Yeah,
differences.
yeah, you're right. Hmm
Or like coming back to 200 years ago and say railways, are you telling me I can put myself in a metal packet and go 30 kilometers per hour? That was like the rocket speed. So, oh my god, that's gonna kill us. I mean, my brain is not ready for that. That was actually true. It happens. But Shinji Sogo was pushing,
uh-huh.
and that crazy idea came up, and it came up in a very actually unsuccessful way. So Shinkansen at the beginning, they got a lot of troubles because, for example, the construction costs of the Shinkansen, the first line,
hmm
they were double. I mean, their forecast construction costs, they multiply by two. So that was a lot of political pressure as well, because it's a lot of money we're putting in a new idea we don't really know if it's going to work. And
hmm
eventually they did it, and it worked. And the first time, so when they started the services, there was a Shinkansen about one train per hour, and like just a few months later, they need to double the frequency.
Oh, wow.
So eventually now, which is amazing now, if you go to Tokyo Station, there's a
Mm.
Shinkansen to Osaka every 4 minutes,
Yeah, I was gonna say it's
three,
3 or 4 minutes,
4.
isn't it? Yeah.
Maybe now with Corona is moved to 4. Okay, but the thing is that when we think about it, I mean that's a metro frequency,
Mm.
right? So
hmm
this is amazing how they have achieved that now. And this is something I want to just give a little bit more inputs on that. The whole success of the Shinkansen was actually his own failure. So
Hmm.
Shinkansen was so successful that
hmm
eventually everyone wanted to have that. And this is a story we have seen all over the world. We have seen Spain, we have seen in France, we have seen in China, we have
hmm
seen in the UK when they are developed. Well, I'm not sure if they finished, but the H2S. And now everyone wants to Shinkansen, right? Everyone's high speed rail because, politically speaking, it's a very good thing. And at the time where Japanese National Railways was a public company, the government was pushing that. So they
hmm
started making railways over Japan. And there was a very dark period of Japanese politics, which is called the Tanaka Sushiro time, and he was actually trial in court for other reasons regarding mobility as well, but other reasons regarding planes. The thing is that he starts to make railways to nowhere. He was from Niigata. He made a railway to Niigata, Shinkansen to Niigata, right? And that was possible by just putting more money
Mm,
onto the system. But eventually, the whole system just fell down because it
mm,
wasn't financially sustainable, and this
mm,
led. That was one of the key reasons to lead to the privatization of the of the Japanese national railways. So now we have seen that after that, the operation methods and the building procurement has been modified a lot, and it has improved a lot. So now Shinkansen network is very healthy compared to what it was before. But I would like to stress that Japan in general has a very big issue with timing. So what was the success of Shinkansen was actually his own failure because
mm.
it was not implemented in a very consistent way.
Okay.
Actually, after that it was, and then is when we can see the success we can see now.
Interesting. I think there's so many lessons actually that we can take from the development of, or maybe the success stories of, or even the failures as well. For example, like the Shinkansen, which began as a failure and then developed into a success. If we think about, there's actually quite a few parallels between the big shifts in transportation in Japan and where we are actually right now. So, for example, one of those things that you mentioned, even before like the 1964 Olympics, like right now, okay, the Olympics became like a whole nother thing due to like Corona and things like that. But we're actually more or less, we're in a kind of similar situation where we're looking at um, uh, an imbalanced growth of the demography. So, for example, we don't have a healthy development of younger people, middle-aged people, and then older people. It significantly skews to older people. We also see that there's incredible economic pressure. Japan has had this before and has answered the call. And we've also seen that there's been this push to open more globally. And my personal opinion when it came to the Olympics is I thought that the Olympics would be a great moment to like get back in touch with, it's almost like getting in touch like with an old friend. You know what I mean? Like Japan has had obviously issues historically with many countries, but at the same time it has been for more than less of the time a trusted partner for many economies. And this could have been the moment that you can kind of remember, oh hey, we should maybe do business with Japan again. So let's kind of, keeping in mind that Japan has had the same issues that we're facing right now and overcome them. um, I'm sure, and people often say, why do you go to Japan or why you bother working in Japan? I think a recent study came out. I'm not sure if it was the Forbes 50 list, but there was like the top 50 most innovative companies. Um, uh, I think it was like 10 years ago, 30 of the 50 companies were Japanese, and then now there's three or something. Well, like it's a cull, almost a cull of Japanese companies. And people say, well, why did you bother going to Japan? I bother because I think we've seen this before. We've seen this before and we've been able to overcome it. And I'm pretty sure we can do it again. So if we think about looking forward to the future, when it comes to mobility, when it comes to the developments in Japan, what are you most excited about? What are the areas that you think are really maybe that next phase or that next chapter for Japan? And is there another Shinkansen in the future? Is there another kind of like delightful moment that Japan can bring to the world? What do you think?
Well, I think that Japan, as I say before, it has been a first player in many points of history when it comes to
Hmm.
mobility, and not only with the Shinkansen, with the development of these railway, non-fare revenues, and so on. Digitalization is also a very big thing. But I think importantly, this it was not the point about being the first. It was the point that uh, having a very consistent implementation of those measures.
Hmm.
So I think that we are paying in this era where everything is digitalized and where every day we have a new unicorn coming to our screens. I think that we are losing a little bit the perspective of what is this for? Why do we need to innovate? What is the point of innovation, right? So we need to bring a
Hmm.
value to society, right? So the thing is that I'm very much confident that as long as Japanese mobility companies or Japanese in general remain focused on their raison d'etre of their motto, of bringing sustainable mobility to their uh, customers, to the society. In fact, as long as they remain that, the tool they're going to do that, whether it's all style railways, whether it's a digital platforms, is not going to matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I am very much confident that as the big challenge for railways companies and for transport companies in general is going to be to keep that focus on regarding the economic, the poor economic prospectus they have. So I'm very much excited for that. And I think that it doesn't really matter if when you see at those rankings, I'm very much critic with rankings because rankings by default, by definition, they are exclusive. So if we have, for example, the same hair length, then we
Your
will
hair's
both
long,
put,
by the way. As Ares hair is
okay,
about
all
four
right, I
times
will take
longer
this.
than my hair.
Yeah, but what I mean is that if you have two countries that they have similar innovation score, whatever you define the score, one should be first, one should be second. But that doesn't make the country better than the others, right? So
Mm-hmm.
as long as we this innovation or this position in the world is translate into the welfare of the citizens or the better quality of life, I think it doesn't really matter if you're the first, the second, or third, or the 100 in how innovative is your country, but rather how much of that innovation translate in value for the
Mm-hmm.
people who live there. So I think that to enhance that value, the Japanese companies are now definitely investing and putting a high bet on digitalization.
Mm-hmm.
The government is put by the government, where I mean I'm also in several like conversations with the government. I'm member of several commissions here as well, and the government is also looking at how it regards that digitalization process more for economic reasons as well as for society reasons. But overall, this digitalization process that we are seeing, it will not succeed if we forget uh, who we are, right? If we forget what is actually our base layer, right? I like to quote a movie which I personally like, even though it's not very historically accurate, which is The Last Samurai. So
Mm-hmm.
in The Last Samurai, which is a very old, it's a 20 years old movie. Tom Cruise is actually taking the role of the foreigner in Japan in this turmoil era of the Meiji century. The thing is that at the end of the movie, the when he faced the emperor and he explains how the samurais were living, the emperor was like saying, "We should not forget who we are. So we have new railways, we have machine guns, we have technology, but in the end we have our essence, we have our
Mm-hmm.
focus. So
Mm-hmm.
as long as the mobility companies still work for that sustainable link between society and transportation, any tool, whether it's railways, machine or not machine guns, but digitalization or whatever, it will be secondary.
Mm-hmm. That's so important and really so true. I think there's two things, two conversations come to mind on that. One is recently we had Eric Matsunaga on the podcast, and he talked about um, how the key to success in the next phase or the next chapters of our growth will not be found in just copying global models, but rather in creating an organic Japanese model. So, for example, people have been very critical in terms of like lifetime employment and not having job titles and things like that. Whereas his argument was that for a very long time served Japan really well. So perhaps maybe the like the not having job titles or things like that, maybe that's essentially just the representation of the essence of what is going on, right? Because the essence is, well, it doesn't really matter what your job title is, you work here, so just do what needs to be done, right? Whereas actually this might, if we reframe that, or if we give that a new name, maybe that actually might be something that might help innovation in a Japanese company, because instead of saying you're only responsible for product, or you're only responsible for design, or you're only responsible for IT, maybe people's minds open up a little bit and they think, oh, actually maybe I'm responsible for everything, and maybe I should stand up and I should share my opinion on many things. And another conversation was about how transportation, or very often digitalization and design, can be translated into how might we capture culture, cultural assets, and then transform them into like a digital narrative. Like, how can we capture culture and then translate that digitally? So if we think about the essence or the culture that you mentioned, obviously quoting The Last Samurai, and I don't know why, but Japan loves Tom Cruise for some like really strange reason. um, but if we think about that, what are some of the maybe the cultural elements that you think we might benefit from seeing in transport and mobility?
Yeah, I think that we tend to criticize about from I mean I live in 5 countries already, and I think that of course every region, not even every country, but every region has their own methods, their
Hmm.
own, we can call it culture,
Hmm.
and business practices. But I think that we often complain, we often criticize how Japanese well, they deal with innovation and where they lie behind. And I definitely am the first person to identify those points, because they happens as they happen everywhere, all over the
Hmm.
world. But I think that one thing which we often forget is about sometimes the way they are doing actually works.
Hmm.
So we talk about, as you say, we talk about in the world right now. There's a big for the last 10 years there has been a lot of conversation about digitalization, the next new solution that is going to solve our
Hmm.
transport issues, right? But when you remain loyal to your values, when you remain
Hmm.
focused on your values, then you can be more you can criticize the new things are coming, but criticize in a way that you can actually find what may work, what may not work, right? So I think this is a very big difference with the Japanese, because even though we made for many Europeans or for the many Anglo-Saxon people may look like these practices are not the most efficient ones or the most
Hmm.
optimal ones, they actually work for the environment they are set. Some of them they don't, and they are changing. They are
Hmm.
changing very slowly, because the environment fits slow change on
Hmm.
a very consistent, small increases in a very consistent way. So I think we should more. We never. I think we, as a me and being a foreign in Japan, I do appreciate precisely these new values that I didn't have at home, and I can actually grasp them and think and assess them, not to evaluate them, but to see what kind of good things I can learn from them. How can I
Hmm.
implement new things into the new processes? And I do believe. I mean, my experience with Japanese companies is that if you can bring something new to them, but not, you don't focus about the thing you are bringing, but how would you
Hmm.
implement in the current processes, they are, you don't have much issue for them, because
Hmm.
they are not stupid. Overall, they are people who try to optimize what they are doing, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and if we think about that, these companies, particularly like the Keiretsu type companies, that they've been in business for at least 100 years, at least. Others, many more hundreds of years, 200 300 years, some of these companies, right? So when we say that Japan can't innovate, I would argue being relevant in business for over 100 years, for me, suggests you have an ability to adapt, suggests that maybe not everything that you're doing is completely stupid, right? So if we think about, that keeping that in mind, I'd love to kind of wrap up this conversation with, what are you most excited about, or opportunities? Maybe it's other companies, maybe it's other startups, maybe it's whoever. But what are you most excited about, for this next kind of period, or this next kind of development of transportation? From just you personally, what are you most excited about?
In Japan, so we see now a lot of developments on, as I say, on-demand services, because
Hmm.
the more prospectus. And I think Japan, I'm not as much excited as these services where my company I work at is providing one of them. But I'm more excited precisely at how they're implementing them. And I think there's a lot to learn about how Japanese are testing, and how Japanese companies are actually exploring the way they are exploring these new services. So I'm very much excited for the following years to see more of these platform services, and I very much looking forward to see more international cooperation. I myself member of an international organization where we foster these international relationships, and I was working before with the government in China, for example, with the European Union. So I very much look about how Japan can actually export such know-how and support other countries, particularly in Asia, where other developing countries are actually, I do believe, in need of these solutions, and they can make a huge value for them. So I do very
Mm.
much looking forward for digitalization and how Japan can show to the world these good practices.
What do you think some of those practices? Well, let's. I'd love to know what those practices are. For example, that Japan can export, but I'd also love to know what are some of those things that you see. And we've also seen, for me, kind of like a sleeping giant in mobility is Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, particularly places like Malaysia or even like KL. Like I remember I visited my sister, I think in 2017 when she was living in Malaysia. Grab was huge, was as successful basically as Uber is now. And now it's like, 2020 or 2021. If we go back then, Grab had already done like an incredible job, capturing that market. So what are some of those things, maybe more specifically, that you think Japan can export? What are their best practice? And certainly, what do you think maybe those opportunities are for those international companies to maybe bring? Is it simply just services, or what do you think?
I think that, so from the, when you think about Grab or Gojek or these companies which are naturally now facing structural issues, Uber as well, I think the key point for Japan is not to provide that kind of like technology platforms or whatever, because I think other places are doing a little bit better on that. But
Mm-hmm.
what I think Japan does do provide well is to provide some sort of governance
Mm.
regarding transportation solutions. So that integrate transport. JICA is doing a very interesting work on that in Southeast Asia, for example, by providing, by developing railways, and we have seen all over Southeast Asia these kind of initiatives. I think that railway companies have a stream development of this know-how regarding like how they can provide, for example, transport solutions and services,
Mm.
mobility. We have seen, for example, in Thailand, there are Japanese companies operating that. So I think the key thing to is to export, or not to export, but to cooperate with them,
Mm-hmm.
without is precisely that integrate transportation
Mm.
solutions, rather than that
Mm-hmm.
again the technology or the method.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. And I think on that note, I have learned so much from you over this hour, talking us through a little bit about kind of like the history, like you summarized essentially like a century of development in an hour. So thank you so much for that. But maybe just before we sign off, is there anything else that we didn't cover today that you'd like to share?
Well, I think Japanese, I mean, not about we haven't shared, but I think Japanese mobility. I mean, Japan is a country that remains very, still remains isolated. Not isolated, but is very far away from the information centers in the West, right? So, me
Mhm.
being a Western, being a European, I found that one thing I when I came here, I wanted to do, and I think I've been to a certain extent successful in that, is to bring that bridge between
Mm,
overseas countries and Japan, right? And I see
mhm,
Japan has a lot of potential, and it has a lot of things we can learn from. That I would like to see more, precisely more interest from what is going in Europe, Australia, Americas, Asia in general, what is going on, and create that kind of like shared platform, that
mm,
knowledge change, right? So I think that I would like to invite to any
yeah.
of people in the audience to, if you don't know about Japan, or if you know about Japan but you don't know about mobility, just get in touch and try to approach and try to understand what Japan is doing on, because I think it's very amazing. And what it may not looks like the high tech solutions that we can see all over the world, but the way they are building up a small structure step by step is something unique that I really like to share, and I really see a lot of things to learn from
Mm.
there in Japan.
Thank you so much, Azarel. This is essentially why the Business Karaoke podcast exists, because there's so many people in Japan with that are doing incredible things that I would say is really talking about the Japan of today. We're doing business in the Japan of today. It's not, we're not talking about how it was like 30 years ago or whatever. We're really looking at Japan right now and we're saying, how can we, build a way forward? How can we write that next chapter? But I think with that sensitivity or that sensibility of, um, appreciating where we've come from, appreciating the history, but then also being able to leverage both best practice in Japan as well as abroad, and then bring those people together. So I think in terms of, I think a lot of people that listen to the Business Karaoke podcast can appreciate or can empathize with your willingness to connect those dots. So on that note, I'm super looking forward to how this develops. And mobility is one of those things, keeps moving, regardless of whether people are ready for it or not. So I'm really looking forward to having you come back and share with us, where we are even in, 6 months or 12 months time. So you're welcome back on the Business Karaoke podcast whenever you like.
Thank you very much, and I really like your invitation to this session, and I really hope our audiences also enjoy this podcast as much as I enjoy to serve them.
Me too, me too. So on that note, we wish everyone a wonderful day, and maybe you're even listening to this on some kind of like a transportation or some kind of mobility, and now you have a little bit more of a story behind the train that you're on or the car that you're
I would like
driving.
to say, I would like to say that mobility and songs such as rock is actually very compatible. So here's my Share Mobility Rocks. It is an event we conducted recently, and we mix share mobility in Japan and rock. So these two things are
Shared
actually very,
mobility
very
rocks. Is that it? So everyone, okay, I'm gonna add this to the notes. It's called shared mobility rocks. And then maybe I don't know, now we didn't even talk about that at all. We haven't even spoken about shared mobility at all. You're gonna have to come back. We
yeah.
need to do a 2.0.
We definitely need to come back. But now I need to take a Shinkansen, so
Exactly. Perfect cameo for the Shinkansen. So on that note, everybody, look out for
thank you very
Aracel
much.
Back 2.0, where we talk about shared mobility.
Sure, let's talk next time.